Hello fellow gamists. I want to talk about Nuzlocking today, and a ROM hack I've been enjoying quite a bit, Run&Bun, and if you should attempt to Nuzlocke it. Originally this was going to be my typical fully scripted style of video, but I kept being unhappy with it and with the way it was going, so instead I just decided to make it more informal and less edited overall, just speaking from the dome more or less, though I have notes on the side obviously. Before I can answer the question, let's first talk about Nuzlocking and ROM hacks broadly. Nuzlocking is different than it used to be. Players are better than ever and many value challenge over a narrative. Many have added rules to make Nuzlocks more viewable and less grindy, like rare candies, many use documentation and calculators, and many plan battles ahead of time. Fully analyzing the AI, Emerald Kaizo is a great example of this, where players started just completely planning out fights and like learning how the entire Emerald AI worked. And as far as I at least saw, Emerald Kaizo was kind of the tipping point from where Nuzlocks became this like story thing of wanting to protect your Pokemon and forming a bond with them to being like a proper challenge that people wanted to beat. Where you got the two groups of the tryhards and the casuals. Now, tryhards want difficult games, so ROM hacks have been attempted more often. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. A good example of this would, for example, be Radical Red. Radical Red, as far as I know at least, is a ROM hack that has so much to do for each battle that it's just extremely tedious to plan for every battle and reset your IVs constantly because you have just too many options, essentially. Now, Run&Bun was actually made with Nuzlocking in mind. It was not made for Nuzlocking, but the features kept Nuzlocking in mind. So, for example, you have things like level caps, an infinite rare candy, you have a very good encounter variety, and the move availability of Pokemon is all done with like a Nuzlocking challenge in mind. But a lot of people also say that Run&Bun sort of went over the edge. I've seen arguments of it being difficult in a very unfair way. Now, I can't really attest to this because I haven't gotten that far in the game and I've not watched a full playthrough of it, but I have seen that later on in the game you get things like Permanent Magma Storm, you know, like Heatran's signature move that traps you and does a shit ton of damage every turn, Permanent Tailwind for the opponent, and Permanent Aurora Veil. Really difficult things to have in a Nuzlocke, especially when you're facing endgame teams, but I also know that at that point you do get tools to deal with those things. It's not like you're stuck there with not a single ghost or flying type that can switch out of... I actually don't know if flying types can switch out of Magma Storms, but I know that ghost types can. And you get shed shells and stuff. Like, it's not impossible, but it is extremely difficult. There's also some other things that make the game very difficult, such as, for example, the custom AI that was made. Now, it existing is generally pretty fun in my opinion. The AI is better and more understandable in many cases, though the AI document is very long, very, very long. And you kind of have to learn the whole thing, not like by rote, but it's good to at least memorize a few portions, though it kind of happens as you play if you're Nuzlocking the game. But yeah, let's stop beating around the bush and let's talk about Run&Bun generally, what it actually is, and if it sounds fun to you. Now, I do need to stress again that I've not finished the game, I've not seen a full playthrough, my experience kind of ends at Norman. But I've seen snippets of the game and I feel qualified to talk about it generally. But if I do say something wrong, please point out in the comments, but also please do it in a nice way so that it's actually helpful and I can like pin it and respond to it if there's something like majorly wrong. Let's just go through the features. Like I said, the game is generally very difficult, and this comes in the form of a few things. Number one, level caps are mandatory. This is not a Nuzlocke thing, you just cannot overlevel, with one exception being rare candies, which I will get to later. Now, the level caps can be a bit frustrating for people who are not used to them, but I do think that they add to the challenge in a fun way, because a lot of the time when you're playing a Pokemon game, the answer to beating a fight is just level up higher and just overrun the gym leader with high levels, and most Nuzlockes from like casual players that I've seen die have been because they just didn't want to grind, which is also why it's very, very nice that you get an infinite rare candy that gets you to the level cap. You can also overlevel past level cap with rare candies, not the infinite candy, but specifically rare candies, which are a limited resource and that you have to usually do some extra fights for, or you have to discover them or do fights in specific ways, and they allow you to level over the cap. This is important because the level caps were designed in a very forward-thinking way, where certain moves and evolutions have been placed just beyond beyond the level cap of where they would be really useful. A good example for this is Yamper. Kind of useless for Brawly. In this game, Brawly's the first gym leader. But if you give it the rare candy, then it evolves and gets Psychic Fang and is incredible for the fight. Another one that comes to mind would be Weasel. Weasel evolves into Floatzel if you give it a rare candy on Roxanne, and is very, very, very useful for that fight. It doesn't mean that the Pokemon are useless beyond that, but it does mean that if you want to make a certain fight easier, looking at your rare candies can be a really great option to see how you can improve the safety of fights. Heart scales are also a mechanic in this game. I think they're pretty cool, but I think they have been implemented a bit badly in the sense that there's not enough of them. Basically, you can find heart scales as like hidden items. You kind of have to look up where they are until you get the item finder, which is a bit into the game. So for like a casual beginner player, it would probably be useful to like look up where the heart scales are. They allow you to do things like maximize one IV, relearn moves from your Pokemon's movesets, including moves that they don't learn via level up, but are like, I guess you could call them egg moves or something. Moves they can't learn outside of heart scales. And you can also change their nature. Now, changing the nature costs 3 heart scales as opposed to 1 for all the other ones. This is the part that I really don't like, because natures, yes, they can be important, but the fact that it's a choice between maximizing 3 IVs or learning 3 moves that can be as good as Encore, or, you know, changing 1 nature, it's just very rarely worth it, and it makes me just very hesitant to use heart scales. I just wish there were more of them. And yeah, like, it's difficult to know when to use them, but for experienced runners who are very good at resource management, I do think they are a very, very fun extra layer of mechanics. The custom AI is another new mechanic, which I think is pretty sick. Like I said, it's a very long document, it's a lot to learn, but it does make the fights a lot more fun. And when you're in a battle and your plan doesn't go the way you wanted it to, being able to look up what happens next, it centers your mind. You know, because you're sitting there thinking, shit, I got crit on a Pokemon that was very bad. What happens now? Looking at what the AI says is going to happen now stops you from doing like the typical, I guess in a fighting game it would be button mashing, but in this case it would just be like making rash decisions without thinking ahead too much. But like I said, it can be a lot. There's also some other smaller changes to not the AI, but the mechanics of the game, like the battling mechanics generally. A lot of moves have been changed, very much for the better in my opinion, because most moves that had weird 90%, 85% accuracies or something have just been switched to be 100% accurate. This makes physical rock types actually so useful, because Rock Slide just hits. It just hits your target. And it makes rock types a lot more fun to use, because you actually get to somewhat exploit their defensive profile and their offensive profile way more. Now, this hasn't been done for every move. There are, for example, certain status moves that have been made more accurate, but still not 100%, as to allow for these kinds of strategies where you just like put something to sleep to not be like super dominating. You can still go for it if you need like a risky strategy, but generally speaking, they are not worth it to use all the time. Crits have also been made more common. In terms of battling mechanics, this game is kind of between Gen 3 and Gen 8, I think, in that crits are now 1 in 16 instead of 1 in 32. But like, other than that, the battling mechanics are from Gen 8, so with things like Mega Evolution, the dynamic speed, all that stuff. So it would be helpful if you know the newer game mechanics somewhat well, though there is a document as well that shows you which mechanics have been changed or adapted or whatever. The big thing, in my opinion, that is important to say about this whole AI and game mechanic thing is that it makes the barrier of entry to this game very, very high. This is not a game that you can jump into if you are not ready for it. Basically, if you're gonna Nuzlocke this game, you need to plan almost every fight. In the beginning, you can just wing some of them because opponents will have underevolved Pokemon and not great movesets, but even here, planning fights can be important, and it can take more than an hour to plan certain fights because there's just so many contingencies you need to account for. You need to be prepared for crits, all that stuff. You do get better at this. I used to take way longer, and even now I still take a long time to prepare fights, but I've seen people rush through the early game in like 5-6 hours. So like total, like including all the planning. But that is definitely like a thing you'll have to learn and get better. Though that is, in my opinion, one of the fun things about Nuzlocking this game is that you can really feel yourself getting better at this particular skill. Another thing to mention for people who may not be familiar with these kinds of challenge ROM hacks is that there are no EVs. Not every ROM hack does this, but I personally prefer it a lot. EVs are a double-edged sword in that they can make the game more easy if you're the only one getting them, such as if you're playing like a regular Pokemon game, just like no ROM hack, nothing. You will just like be stronger stronger than your opponent's baseline. And it's one of those mechanics that can kind of be exploited. Most Nuzlockers of casual games don't EV train, but it's technically optimal to do that. And it's one of those like small things where the rules of the Nuzlocke, if you're actually trying to win, force you to do things that are not fun, similar with like grinding, like for levels. So I very much prefer when games just remove EVs altogether, because it also changes the viability of certain Pokemon. I, as a competitive player, am used to certain Pokemon being better than others, like certain Pokemon archetypes. Well-balanced Pokemon, like Pokemon with balanced stat lines, are generally not that good competitively because they're not specialized enough. If you look at something like Hisui and Samurott versus Weavile, they kind of fit the same role, but Weavile just does away with some of the unimportant stats because it's meant to be a fast attacker. It doesn't need that much special attack, doesn't need that much defense. Whereas Samurott, being a starter Pokemon, needs to be more balanced because starter Pokemon are meant to be more balanced. At least back in the day. Nowadays, they are a bit more optimized. But in ROM hacks where you don't have EVs, well-balanced Pokemon actually end up being a lot better because they can actually take hits and do damage without constantly being in a risk of getting one-shot, because you can really only use frail fast Pokemon as lead Pokemon because you almost never get free switches. Obviously there are exceptions and you can still switch in frail Pokemon, but you need to be so careful about it. I can switch my Torterra in on almost anything that's not an ice move, whereas if I want to switch in my Floatzel, I have to be super careful because it just dies to almost anything. It also makes defensive Pokemon in general better, in my experience at least. One of my experiences that kind of made me radicalized against EVs was when I tried to Nuzlocke a ROM hack called Prismatic Moon, where both you and your opponents have EVs. The reason I hated that was because defensive Pokemon needed to be like max defense or special defense and HP in order to take hits from opposing Pokemon that would be like max attack or special attack and speed. So you kind of wouldn't have any say in how your defensive Pokemon are statted. And for offensive Pokemon, it's very difficult to make their EVs correctly, and you have to like constantly keep readjusting them for every fight. It's so incredibly tedious, and the reward isn't even that great. Frail Pokemon still just die to things, so they're still difficult to switch in. And it also means that opposing defensive Pokemon are just a pain in the ass to deal with, because you essentially need to have a Pokemon that's a Stallmon that can just like Toxic Stall or something. Because if you send in your own fast, frail attackers on a perfectly statted defensive Pokemon from an opponent that has like perfect IVs, perfect EVs and stuff, you're just risking crits, and you can't risk that many crits. Your opponents can take as many crits as they want because there's 500 of them, and they can lose 499 times, whereas you only need to lose once for the run to be over. So yeah, I think removing EVs generally makes the game more fun. There's also some other things that make the game more difficult. One of the ones that gets brought up very often is that gym leaders always have a legendary, even if it starts off kind of simple with a Kubfu. Kubfu's still no joke, but Kubfu is not that's not the beast of that fight. It's definitely kind of like an add-on. Zygarde's definitely difficult. Zeraora, ironically, I found very easy to deal with, but yeah, like every gym leader is legendary, and starting with Watson, which is the third gym leader, they also all have a mega. The fights can be incredibly tough to plan for, especially because some fights will also have Pokemon leading that's set up terrain or weather. And if you set up weather or terrain with an ability in this game, it's actually permanent. It does not have a timer, and you do not get access to weather abilities yourself. So as far as I know, at least, there is no way to override weather. You just kind of have to take what you're given. I also don't think you get the weather moves, but I may be wrong on that. One of the only ways I found to remove terrain is like Defog, which I think some Pokemon get, and like Steel Roller. It's not something you can do easily. In general, a lot of moves have been taken away from the player. I've seen people complain about this because they felt it took agency away from the player. I am mixed on it because I do also understand that if you give the player access to moves like Quiver Dance, Sword Stance, even just like Howl, though I guess some Pokemon have Howl, like it depends on how good the Pokemon is. Setup moves just allow you to break the game wide open because you just need to find like one moment in the fight where it's safe for you to switch in that Pokemon and use like 2 setup moves, then you can just sweep. So I understand why they're kept very locked off from the player in most cases. The same also goes for certain Pokemon, though I do think this is less because the creator of the game wanted you to not have certain Pokemon because they're too strong, but more because how do you fit like 1,000 Pokemon into one region while still having the encounter tables be reasonable. That you can't have 25 Pokemon available on a route just so that every Pokemon is obtainable somewhere. Now, this does mean that some Pokemon are not obtainable. I am very sad about Dunsparce, but I do understand that it's not available because it would be just too powerful, obviously. I mean, it'd be like giving the player Arceus, essentially, just like better. But yeah, it can feel like options are being taken away from you. Another thing is that opponents will have access to these moves, whereas you won't. This can be kind of frustrating because, for example, you can catch a Bunnelby very early in the game. And it's a decent Pokemon, I've been using it, and it does okay, but you will never get access to huge power, whereas opposing Diggersby are extremely dangerous because they actually get huge power. And that happens a lot, where like opposing Pokemon get access to cool abilities and cool moves that you just don't, despite you being able to obtain some of the same Pokemon. And that can feel a bit shitty. However, as I said before, generally you do get access to the tools you need to beat these strategies, right? If your opponent has some completely out there strategy that looks just so ridiculous, if you look in your box, most of the time you will have something in there, unless you just got Omega unlucky on your encounters or you lost some Pokemon beforehand. Then of course, it's not that it's your fault, but you know, that's just how Nuzlocks are sometimes. Another cool thing that this game has added is a bunch of quality of life improvements. One of the most notable one that's actually outside of the game is the calculator. You're gonna see every person use this, but there's a showdown calculator that has every fight like put into it. All the Pokemon have been exported into it. This allows you to just very seamlessly go from one fight to another when you're planning. There are some mistakes sometimes, like King's Rock, for example, the held item King's Rock is never exported because it has like an asterisk or like an apostrophe in the name, so the calculator doesn't recognize it. So you will still need to look at the spreadsheet, just like double check sometimes, but for the most part, it makes it just so much easier to plan the fights at, because you never have to like import your opponent's team one Pokemon at a time for each fight. Equally also, you never have to import your team one Pokemon at a time manually. There's a Lua script you can run in your emulator where it'll export all the Pokemon in your PC, except I think for the last box, because that's where a lot of people put their dead Pokemon, the dead box. And again, just makes it so seamless to catch a new Pokemon, put it in the calculator, immediately see what it does. You can also check IVs and stuff in-game, by the way. Like it's all highlighted in the game itself, but having it in a separate window can just be really, really helpful. Another super cool feature that I've not seen too many people use is actually a color code feature. It's like down here. It shows you if your Pokemon outspeeds something, if it one-shots something, if it is one-shot, and if it walls something. So if it can take, I think, 4 hits, or maybe 5, I don't know. It's not always super accurate. It gets confused with certain moves, like for example, Explosion. Pokemon won't generally click Explosion to like kill something unless they're super low HP, but the calculator will still show all your Pokemon like dying to it. Although most of the time, you know, they will, and that is relevant, but in certain cases, the colors can be incorrect. Although for the most part, I think, especially for casual players, they are very, very helpful. Oh, and another quality of life thing that I should mention is there is an NPC in each Pokemon Center that allows you to, I mean, one, spend your heart scales and change nicknames, but it also allows you to status your Pokemon. This is something that I hadn't been using up until recently, but it's actually very, very useful for certain fights. Giving your Pokemon a status condition can make certain fights safer. So for example, if an opponent has Thunder Wave and Hypnosis, you can only equip one berry to prevent one of those statuses, but you don't know which one they're going to use because it's essentially a coin flip. So by poisoning your Pokemon, you can just prevent statuses altogether, though of course you will have to deal with the damage. Being able to apply poison also makes it so you can pre-damage your Pokemon easily just by running back and forth, because, you know, you take 1 tick of poison damage every 5 steps or something. So you can put your Pokemon at like very specific HPs to bait certain moves or show kills for certain Pokemon, to manipulate the AI better, essentially. I'm realizing a lot of the things I'm saying might not be comprehensible to people who don't do these kinds of Nuzlocks, but eh. Now with all that out of the way, let me actually answer the question of the video. Should you Nuzlocke Run&Bun? No, with a big asterisk. 2 actually. Let me elaborate. You should play it casually, at least. I think Run&Bun is an incredibly fun game, and I do plan to play through it casually or with a relaxed rule set, just so I can experience the whole game. If you're not restrained by constantly having like a failure condition over your head, this game is incredibly fun. There are so many fun and unique strategies that Dexa put into the game that your opponents use. If there's some weird thing you wanted to see in VGC or in single battles, there's a trainer that has it. For example, there's a trainer in Westturf Tunnel that leads with a Sandspit Sandaconda to set up weather, which, of course, you could just use a Tyranitar instead, but for this point in the game, that'd be too powerful. So instead, you have this Sandaconda, and like, I always wanted to see what a Sandaconda Sand team would look like. Now I have seen it. Or another strategy that often claims some Pokemon lives is a doubled battle where the strategy is that you have a bunch of electric immune Pokemon on one side, and then on the other side, a Pokemon that spams Discharge. So you actually have like Lightning Rod, special attacking Seeking, and a special attacking Marowak. It's terrible to plan for, but just seeing it and like fighting against it, if there's no like threat of having to restart, it's just very fun to see all of this happening. It's very unique. The battles all feel unique. There are very, very few battles that feel like throwaways or battles where it's just kind of there for the sake of it. There's a few, but not that many. I mean, there's even like a fisherman who has a team of 5 unevolved bug types with choice bands, because that's what he's using as bait, because his dialogue is like, oh, I ran out of bait once you beat him. Like, it's just little stuff like that that makes the game's battles very fun. Now, that's the first asterisk. For the second one, I need to talk a bit longer. The game is very, very mentally taxing and difficult, and it can be a huge time investment. But if you like puzzles, you could enjoy it. I would like to remind you also here that a Nuzlocke is not an official game mode. There's not like a setting in the game that you access where it's now a Nuzlocke and your Pokemon get like killed automatically if they faint. The game doesn't change, right? Like, you decide that you want to play it as a Nuzlocke. Nothing forces you to lose your save file. So with that in mind, I do think that if you enjoy those kinds of puzzles and you have the time investment, it is worth it to look into the different rules that might be fun for you, because you can play the game however you want. You could give your Pokemon 2 lives, or you could play with infinite heart scales, or you could handpick your 1 encounter on each route because you want to get certain Pokemon. Beating this game at all, or even just some of the gym leaders, when you have a failure condition is, in my opinion, a pretty big achievement, and people might try and say that it's not. Don't let them gatekeep you. I've had some contact with the Run&Bun Nuzlocking community, and obviously my experiences don't speak for all of them. I've had also some very friendly conversations, but I've had some, frankly, very toxic discussions and just interactions with people in the Run&Bun community where they've been very elitist and making jokes about things like, oh, if you're not making the Elite Four your goal, why are you even playing? Because I always say that like my goal was to beat Norman at a Nuzlocke, because I know that I don't have the skills required to beat the whole game. I'm not that good at Nuzlockes. And I've been made fun of for getting certain encounters. Now again, this is not all the time, it's very rare, but it is indicative of not just the Run&Bun community, but of the Nuzlocking community as a whole. It's very common that they're going to be very, very elitist. And I'm here to say that fuck them. Nuzlockes are a self-imposed challenge. They're supposed to be fun. There's no official rule set. There's not like a Nuzlocke board that can decide your fate if you get 2 encounters on a route because you wanted to catch a specific Pokemon or something. So my actual answer to the question, should you Nuzlocke this game, is yes, with whatever rule set you want. Because again, it's a self-imposed challenge, it's supposed to be fun. This game is just fun generally, so whatever way you enjoy it will be the correct way. And don't let people tell you otherwise. If they do, they're stupid and idiots, and their opinion is invalid, because not everyone has the time, if they're working like a job or go to university, to spend 4 hours planning a gym fight and then do 1 gym fight. You know, it's understandable why people might loosen the rules in this game specifically. Now, if you want some ideas of alternative rule sets, I actually prepared some stuff here for those who want a bit of a nudge. I call it the pae-leo. Rolls right off the tongue. It's graded 1 through 5 stars, and you can imagine 6 stars as being like a regular hardcore Nuzlocke. So with all the rules of permadeath, 1 encounter per route, nicknames, reset if you wipe, no items, level cap, etc. And then each star you take away becomes easier. And all of them are valid. A 1-star attempt is just as valid as a 5-star attempt. And you can also edit these as much as you want. I just wanted to do like a cute 1 to 5 stars thing. This is not anything official. You can do whatever you want to. Now for 5 stars, I envision a regular hardcore Nuzlocke in terms of the rules, except this is kind of Run&Bun specific. You get 1 encounter per unique area table. I don't mean that you can fish and surf and grass encounter in every route, but certain areas do have multiple floors or multiple multiple different kinds of encounters. So for example, in Granite Cave, instead of just choosing one floor, you would be allowed to get an encounter on each floor. I have this rule here because there's actually a lot of Pokemon that I think would be very interesting to use, but because there's just better Pokemon in other floors of that area, you kind of just never get them. And this is probably a rule set I will be playing with in the future because I want to see those Pokemon. I think it would be very fun. You know, they're in the game. I wanna see how they were implemented. I also count among this static Pokemon. There's two cases I know about where static Pokemon can technically take your encounter away. The starter Pokemon is not one because they are listed as having been met in a fateful encounter, which is not the same as Route 101, but I believe the fossils that you can revive and cast form have the actual route as their encounter area, meaning technically getting those Pokemon is not allowed if you already got an encounter in that area, but I think that's stupid because I like getting Pokemon. I think catching Pokemon is fun, you know, sue me. I like having Pokemon. So that would be the 5-star added rule. 4-star, triples your heart scales. When you find one, you can cheat yourself in 2 extra. I would recommend you do it with a shop where you can buy them and not just give yourself 999 because otherwise you'd have to keep track of it somewhere else in like a text document, and this is easier. And my reasoning for this is that changing a nature costs 3 heart scales, so tripling your heart scales allows you to just do way more with them. It allows you to actually access the nature changing feature a bit more often. It also allows you to learn a few more moves. You can be a bit more lenient with learning specific moves. One thing I've noticed is that I will sometimes learn certain moves thinking, oh, this will be really useful, and then it just never is, or like some specific fight in the future will be like, oh, if you'd only kept this move from before, it would have made this fight like a lot easier. And a lot of the time that even feels like kind of intended, that like you need to look ahead like multiple fights or like even splits to know what moves to keep and what not to keep. So this just allows you to be a bit less prepared, I guess, when you unlearn movesets, because it's gonna be at least more doable to relearn them. Though, of course, triple heart scales does not mean infinite, so you still need to be careful with your resources. It just basically leaves more room for error and compensates for some bad luck with like IVs and natures. 3 stars gives you infinite heart scales. This allows you to get perfect Pokemon every time. Essentially, you can always perfect your IVs, always perfect your natures, always get all the moves. And you can even change them depending on the fight. This might add some tedium, but the game does become probably a lot more fun for the casual player if you never have to deal with catching a Pokemon and realizing that it's useless. Thank you, Carnivine. I love looking at your IVs. It's just a phone number. I'm not gonna lie, it's a phone number. There is actually a quote-unquote, I guess, official rule set that is similar to this that I've seen people talk about called a sandbox lock or a sandbox mode Nuzlocke, where you get infinite heart scales, but losing one Pokemon means resetting the run. So 1 death equals reset. This is essentially that rule set, but without the 1 death reset rule. Because I feel like for someone who's trying to make the game easier, 1 death reset is not going to be it. At 2 stars, your Pokemon get a Guardian Angel, meaning they can die once before having to be released, before dying. This will mean you need to keep a separate list somewhere, or you're going to have to nickname Pokemon that have lost a life by adding like a star to them or something. So this might be a bit tedious to keep up, but I think for casual players who enjoy Nuzlockes and want there to be a set rule set without it taking 50 attempts to beat a game, I think this could be like a fun rule set to have. Again, gives you some room for error, lets you also learn from your mistakes in a way that is more acceptable, I would say. It's a lot easier to stomach if you lose a Pokemon to like a mechanic you didn't know, or you oversaw a Pokemon holding a specific item and then you get to keep it, but now if you make another mistake, it's dead. Instead of like, oh, now you lost a super important Pokemon and you're gonna have to compensate later and it's gonna snowball and you're gonna have to reset eventually. This makes it more of a proper learning experience for people who are not that experienced with these kind of like super difficult hardcore Nuzlocke, ROM hacks, whatever. And then finally, 1 star, your Pokemon are immortal. They can't die. If they faint, they're fine. This one is here for people who essentially want to have a fail condition, but not one that makes the game impossible to approach as a casual player. You do still wipe, or you do still reset if you wipe, so if you lose a battle, you still lose the run, but you can just like throw your Pokemon away in a battle, get free switches. It changes how the game works significantly because, you know, getting free switches is incredibly useful in Nuzlockes. This is probably the rule set that I would recommend most people go for if they are either unexperienced Nuzlockers or have only Nuzlocked like regular Pokemon games, like Fire Red, like base games. Because what this allows you to do is, for the most part, you can enter a fight without having to look everything up beforehand. The thing, at least from what I've heard from my friends, that turns people away from Nuzlocke in this game is that you have to kind of look everything up. As in, you need to look at what Pokemon your opponents have, you need to look at what items they have, you need to look ahead if there's a gauntlet, or if certain trainers are skippable perhaps, or you can save them for later. I'd say that this rule set doesn't free you from that entirely, but I doubt you will ever have to calculate anything. You will never have to calc a whole battle ahead of time, and taking away that tedium is probably going to be pretty fun for a lot of players. Now, these are rules that I generally have fun playing with, although, again, if you don't like them, feel free to use any combination of them if you like. And if you want some ideas on ways to make your Nuzlocke easier or more challenging or more unique, I'd love to talk about it in the comments, because I actually really like coming up with like weird challenge mode rule sets. I should also note that the pae-leo particularly pertains to Run&Bun, but could also apply to other hard ROM hacks like Emerald Kaizo or Garbage Green, though with things like hard scales, you'll obviously have to do some changes in how you approach that. You're gonna have to have PK Hex active to... Alright, that's kind of all I have to say about this. A bit of a different style of video, but I still hope you enjoyed it. I normally make more scripted stuff, and also I don't really talk about Nuzlocks outside of like the streams, but still hope you had fun watching the video. A bit more rambly, but maybe people like that. I don't know. Like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff. I think saying that does something. At least people say that it does something when you say that. I don't know. I don't know how YouTube works. I just like talk about Pokemon, and people for some reason sometimes listen to me. It's really your fault. Like, I don't know. Why are you still watching the video? Like, I'm just talking bullshit at this point. Like, have you cleaned your room? When was the last time you changed your bed sheets? I'm calling all of y'all at the end of the video. When was the last time you changed your bed sheets? Go change your bed sheets. You should change them at least every 2 weeks. Come on. Stinky.